There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a marriage in its final year. Not the silence of peace. The silence of a held breath. I was elbow-deep in dishwater when I heard it, the buzz of my husband and Appo's phone against the granite, a sound I and Appo's learned to recognize the way I once learned to recognize the difference between outgoing and incoming fire. Rhythm. Cadence. Intent. Grant was in the garage, running the table saw for some shelving unit he and Appo's been and getting to and for 3 months. I dried my hands on the dish towel. It smelled like fabric softener now, not gun oil, not the ozone and diesel smell of a forward operating base, not anything that belonged to the person I used to be. And I looked at the screen lighting up on the counter. Miss you already. Same time Thursday? No name attached. Just a contact saved as a single letter K. I didn't and Appo's dropped the plate I was holding. I didn't and Appo's gasp. 12 years of service teaches you that the loudest reactions are usually the least useful ones. I set the plate in the rack, dried my hands again, out of habit not necessity, and picked up the phone. It wasn't an Appo's locked. He never locked it around me anymore. That, in hindsight, should have told me everything. A man hiding something usually locks his phone. A man who and Appo's stopped caring whether you find out doesn't and Appo's bother. There were 41 messages with K going back 6 weeks. I read exactly 3 of them before I set the phone back down, screen dark, in the precise spot where it had been vibrating a moment before. My hands were steady. That was the part that used to comfort me. Back when steady hands meant something useful. Pulling a tourniquet tight, threading a suture in bad light, keeping a rifle level when the ground under you wasn't an Appo's. Now steady hands just meant I had gotten good at feeling nothing when it counted. My name is Ren Cassidy. For 9 years I was a combat medic attached to a Ranger battalion, the only woman most of those men had ever trusted to put her hands inside their chest cavities in the dark. I deployed 4 times. I held the hand of a 20-year-old private from Tulsa while the last of him leaked out onto a helicopter floor over Kunar Province, and I kept my voice level the entire time because that and Appo's what you do. You keep your voice level so the dying dawn and Appo's have to carry your fear along with their own. I came home with a Bronze Star I never talk about, a knee that predicts rain better than the weather app, and a silence in me that I mistook for a long time for peace. I met Grant at a 4th of July barbecue 18 months after my discharge, back when I still wore my hair regulation short and flinched at fireworks I and Appo's forgotten to expect. He was easy in a way nothing in my life had been easy. He laughed loud. He didn't and Appo's ask about deployments. He liked that I could talk about torque specs and hated it, eventually, that I still thought in terms of sectors of fire when we walked into a crowded restaurant, positioning myself so I could see the door. For the first 3 years it worked, in the imperfect patched-together way that most things worth having work. I remember a Tuesday, it shouldn't and Appo's have mattered, it was nothing, but I remember it with a clarity I don't and Appo's extend to whole deployments, when Grant found me on the bathroom floor at 2 a.m., not crying, just sitting because the pipes had made a sound like an idling APC and my body had gone somewhere without asking my permission. He didn't and Appo's say anything stupid. He didn't and Appo's tell me to relax or that everything was fine. He just sat down on the tile next to me in his boxers, put his hand flat on my sternum the way I and Appo's taught him to check for a racing heart, and stayed there until my pulse came back down under 100. That was the man I married. I have spent the last 2 years of my marriage looking for him in the stranger who slept next to me, and coming up empty. I think about the whole shape of that first year more often than I let on. There was a night, maybe 8 months into dating, when I finally told him about Dawes, the private I and Appo's nearly lost in Kunar, the one whose blood I still sometimes feel dried into the creases of my knuckles in dreams I don't and Appo's remember having until I wake up flexing my hands. I hadn't and Appo's told anyone that story outside of a VA counselor and Appo's office. Grant didn't and Appo's flinched, didn't and Appo's reach for me too fast, didn't and Appo's try to fix it with a hug the way people do when they want your pain to be over more than they want to understand it. He just asked quietly and what happened after? Is he okay? And the right question, the only question that actually mattered. And I remember thinking with something like relief, this is a man who knows how to sit still inside someone else in Appo's worst night. We got married the following spring in Denise and Appo's backyard, 60 folding chairs and a caterer who undercharged us because her brother had served. I wore my grandmother and Appo's pearl earrings and combat boots under the dress, a compromise Grant had suggested himself, laughing, because he said a woman like me shouldn't Appo's have to pretend her feet belonged to someone softer. I believed, standing under that rented arbor, that I had found a man who loved the whole shape of me, the softness and the shrapnel both. It is a strange specific grief to watch that belief erode one flat conversation at a time, so slowly you can and Appo's point to the day it finally gave out. Somewhere in year 4, I stopped needing him to sit on bathroom floors. The nightmares thinned out. I got steady work as a facilities safety inspector, the kind of job where the worst thing that happens is a fire door propped open with a cinder block. And somewhere in that same stretch, Grant stopped finding me interesting. I watched it happen in real time and told myself I was imagining it, the way his eyes went flat when I talked about work, the way in quote, "How was your day?" in quote, became a formality instead of a question, the way he started going to the new CrossFit gym on Route 9 4, then 5, then 6 mornings a week, coming home smelling like a body that had worked hard for someone other than me. I told myself a lot of things over those 2 years. That marriages have seasons. That the flatness was mutual, that I and Appo's gone quiet too, that quiet people build quiet lives together, and there and Appo's nothing tragic in that. I was, it turns out, extremely good at triage, at deciding which wounds needed my full attention and which ones I could pack, stabilize and leave for later. I had just never used that skill on my own marriage before, and it turns out that when you pack a wound and never come back to dress it properly, it festers. I stood in my kitchen holding a dish towel that smelled like fabric softener, and I let myself, for the first time in 2 years, actually look at the wound. Grant came in from the garage 40 minutes later, sawdust on his forearms, grinning about a mitered corner he and Appo's finally gotten square. I was sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee poured, his in the blue mug he liked, mine in nothing because I didn't and Appo's actually want coffee. I wanted his hands occupied with something familiar when I said what I was about to say. And quote, "Who and Appo's SK?" And quote, I asked. I watched it land. Not shock, Grant has never been a good enough actor for real shock, but the particular scramble of a man doing math he didn't and Appo's expect to have to do out loud. He set the mug down without drinking from it. And quote, "What are you talking about?" And quote, "Your phone buzzed." I looked. 41 messages. 6 weeks. I only needed to read 3. And quote, "He didn't and Appo's deny it. I and Appo's LL give him that much." Grant has never been a coward about consequences, only about the small daily honesties that would have prevented needing to face them. He exhaled through his nose, dragged a hand down his face and said, and quote, "Kaylee. She and Appo's one of the trainers at Ignite." And quote, "How long?" And quote, "Ren." And quote, "How long, Grant?" And quote, "For months." And quote, he said it like a man setting down a heavy box he and Appo's been carrying too far. And quote, "It wasn't and Appo's supposed to. I didn't and Appo's plan for it to turn into anything. You and Appo's been so far away, Ren. For years. I feel like I and Appo's been married to a locked door." And quote, there it was. The reframe. I recognized the maneuver instantly because I and Appo's watched enough interrogations to know the shape of a man trying to make his choice into my fault. I felt something old and cold move through my chest. Not rage, not yet, something more like the click a weapon makes when the safety comes off. A small mechanical sound underneath everything else. And quote, "I came home from a war so I could learn how to be boring with you." And quote, I said. And quote, "I worked at it. Every single day for 6 years I worked at being boring, safe, easy because that and Appo's what you said you wanted. You wanted the version of me that flinched less. I gave her to you." And quote, "That and Appo's not fair." And quote, "No." And quote, I agreed. And quote, "It isn't and Appo's nothing about this is fair. I and Appo's am just describing it." And quote, he told me eventually in the roundabout way people tell you things they and Appo's already decided that he wanted a divorce. That Kaylee made him feel like himself again. Whatever that meant to a man who spent his weekday mornings deadlifting next to a 26-year-old in compression leggings. And quote, "She doesn't and Appo's T look at me like I and Oppos am a project and quote, he said, and I felt that land somewhere just beneath my sternum, sharp and precise, because I understood exactly what he meant and hated that I did. I had, somewhere in year 5, started treating our marriage the way I and Oppos been trained to treat a patient with a survivable but complicated wound, something to manage, monitor, keep stable. I hadn't and Oppos T realized until that exact sentence how loudly that management must have read to him as a verdict on who he was. And quote, you didn't and Oppos T want a partner and quote, I said and quote, you wanted a woman who and Oppos D never ask you to be better than comfortable. I gave you 6 years of that. I don't and Oppos T regret giving it to you. I regret that it apparently wasn't and Oppos T the thing you actually needed, and neither of us figured that out until it cost something. End quote. He didn't and Oppos T have an answer for that, not really, just a long exhale and a hand scrubbing back through his hair, the gesture of a man who knows he and Oppos more sinned against himself than sinning in his own accounting and hasn't and Oppos T yet realized how differently the math works from the outside. He wanted the house, we and Oppos D bought it together, but his name had gone on the deed first, some paperwork quirk from before we married, and he and Oppos D apparently already looked into what that meant for him, quietly, weeks before he and Oppos D said a single word to me about any of it. That detail stung more than the affair itself in some ways. The calm, methodical planning underneath the supposed spontaneity of falling for someone else. He wanted it clean. He wanted it soon. I looked at the man across the table from me. Sawdust on his arms, the mug he still hadn't and Oppos T touched, the particular slackness of a face that had already made its decision and was only now getting around to informing me of it. And I felt the strangest, most unwelcome sensation of the entire conversation. Relief. Not for the marriage ending. For the silence finally having a name. End quote, fine end quote, I said. He blinked. End quote, fine? End quote. End quote. You want the house, we and Oppos LL let the lawyers figure out what and Oppos fair. I and Oppos am not going to fight you over square footage, Grant. I fought for things that mattered. This ISN and Oppos T one of them. End quote. It unsettled him more than tears would have. I watched him try to recover his footing, the way a man does when the confrontation he braced for simply declines to arrive. End quote. You and Oppos not even going to Jesus Ren, is anything in there? Do you even feel things anymore? End quote. I stood, rinsed my untouched coffee down the sink and said end quote, I and Oppos I'll be at my sister and Oppos have your attorney send the paperwork there. End quote. Then I went upstairs, packed one duffel with the efficiency of a woman who has packed for deployment on 90 minutes and Oppos noticed more than once, and left him standing in the kitchen with his sawdust and his mitered corner and his mug of coffee going cold. My sister Denise lived 40 minutes north in a converted farmhouse with too many cats and not enough judgment, which made her, at that particular moment, the only person on earth I wanted to be around. She didn't and Oppos T asked questions when I showed up with the duffel bag at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday. She just poured 2 fingers of bourbon into a jelly jar and set it in front of me at her kitchen table, the way you and Oppos D hand a field dressing to someone who wasn't and Oppos T bleeding yet but clearly would be soon. I was 3 sips in when my phone rang. Unknown number, but I already knew. End quote, this is Ren. End quote. End quote, Ren. Hey. It and Oppos Kaylee. End quote. Her voice had the bright, performative warmth of someone reading from a script she and Oppos D rehearsed in her car. End quote, I just wanted to reach out one woman to another because I think there and Oppos been like a really unfair narrative building here, and I wanted to clear the air before things get ugly. End quote. End quote. There and Oppos no narrative, end quote, I said. End quote. There and Oppos a marriage that ended because my husband decided he wanted someone else. I don't and Oppos T need it cleared. End quote. End quote. Right, but see that and Oppos kind of the problem. End quote. Her tone shifted, the warmth curdling fast into something sharper, more rehearsed still, like she and Oppos D practiced this part in the mirror. End quote. Grant and Oppos told me a lot about how things were at home. The distance. Honestly, the coldness. I think you should know that whatever you and Oppos replanning with the lawyers dragging this out, ISN and Oppos T going to make him come back to you. It and Oppos S just going to make you look bitter. End quote. I set the jelly jar down on Denise and Apo's table. Across from me, my sister went very still, the way people do when they can feel a temperature drop in a room they and Apo's not part of. End quote. You called me, end quote, I said, end quote, to warn me not to be bitter about my own divorce, end quote. End quote. I and Apo's am just saying, Grant deserves to move forward without you making this into some kind of battle. He and Apo's already stressed about the money as it is. He works hard for that house. End quote. Something in me that had been quiet for 2 years, quiet since long before I even noticed the marriage curdling, sat forward. Not rage. Something older and steadier than rage. The part of me that used to run toward gunfire because someone needed a tourniquet, not because I enjoyed the noise. End quote. Tell Grant, end quote, I said, end quote, that I and Apo's I'll see his lawyer and Apo's paperwork when it arrives. And tell yourself, since you clearly need to hear it from someone. 4 months in and you and Apo's already fighting his battles for him. That and Apo's not love. That and Apo's a woman doing unpaid labor for a man who trained you to think you owed it to him, end quote. I hung up before she could answer. Denise slid the bourbon bottle 2 inches closer to me across the table, which between sisters is its own kind of eulogy. The call from Kaylee and Apo's business partner came 3 days later, and it was in its way funnier than anything that had happened yet. His name was Marcus Del Rey, and he co-owned Ignite Performance with, as it turned out, Kaylee herself, which explained a certain proprietary anger I had and Apo's expected from a man I and Apo's never met. He introduced himself over the phone with the particular swagger of someone who has spent a career being the loudest man in a room full of mirrors. End quote. Ren, right? Grant and Apo's wife? End quote. End quote. Ex-wife soon. And it and Apo's Miss Cassidy to you, end quote. End quote. Look, I Don and Apo's want to get in the middle of this, but Kaylee and Apo's pretty shaken up. Says you threatened her. End quote. End quote. I told her the truth. If that shakes her, that and Apo's information about her, not about me, end quote. End quote. Here and Apo's the thing, end quote. Marcus and Apo's voice took on the tone men use when they think they and Apo's being reasonable and are in fact being anything but. End quote. You and Apo's apparently got some kind of military chip on your shoulder, and I get it, that and Apo's a lot to carry. But you Don and Apo's get to call my gym and start throwing threats at my staff. Grant and Apo's a member here. Kaylee and Apo's a valued trainer. You come near this place stirring up drama, we and Apo's going to have a problem. End quote. I actually laughed, which surprised us both. End quote. Marcus. I didn't and Apo's call your gym. Kaylee called me. End quote. There was a pause, the particular silence of a man realizing he and Apo's been fed a version of events that didn't and Apo's hold up to 2 follow-up questions. He recovered fast, though, the way people who are used to being believed always do. End quote. Whatever happened, happened. Point is, you need to let this go quietly. Let the lawyers handle the house and stay away from my facility. End quote. End quote, or what? End quote. End quote. Or I make sure everyone in this town knows exactly what kind of woman goes after her husband and Apo's new girlfriend, end quote. End quote. You Don and Apo's know what kind of woman I am, Marcus. End quote. I kept my voice level the way I used to keep it level over a comms channel when the situation on the other end had already gone bad, and getting loud about it wasn't and Apo's going to fix anything. End quote. You know, a rumor Grant probably fed you to make himself feel less like the villain in his own story. That and Apo's a different thing entirely. End quote. End quote. I know you and Apo's causing problems for people who Don and Apo's deserve it. End quote. End quote. Kaylee called me unprompted to lecture me about my own divorce. That and Apo's not me causing a problem. That and Apo's a woman doing damage control for a man who I inspect fire suppression systems, load ratings, and structural egress for a living, and I have never once in 9 years found a commercial gym that passed a first inspection clean. You want me to come by your facility? End quote. End quote. Is that a threat? End quote. End quote. It and Apo's an invitation. I and Appos. LL bring my clipboard. You bring your fire marshal and Appos. S contact information because you and Appos. Re going to need it. End quote. I let that sit for exactly as long as I judged useful, the way you let a needle find its vein before you push the plunger. End quote. But that and Appos. S not actually why I and Appos. M calling you called me, remember? Say what you actually want to say, Marcus. End quote. There was a pause. I could hear him regretting. Then the bluster returned, thinner this time, propped up like a tent pole that had already cracked. End quote. Friday. We do an open community sparring night at the gym. Invite only, some amateur fighters come through, good crowd. Kaylee and Appos, S going to be there. Grant and Appos, S going to be there. You want to keep making noise about being some kind of tough combat veteran? Come to the gym Friday night. Step on the mat with me for 1 round. You survive 5 minutes without tapping I and Appos. I'll personally see to it that Grant gives you full equity on the house. No fight, no lawyers, straight settlement and I and Appos. I'll cover it myself if he balks. You don and Appos. T-show or you tap, you drop the whole house claim and walk away with nothing. Everyone in this town gets to watch exactly how tough Ren Cassidy really is. End quote. It was a stupid bet. Legally worthless. No court in the state would honor a handshake fight for equity agreement. And some sliver of my mind noted that fact with the same clinical detachment I once used to note the caliber of an incoming round. But I wasn't in Appos, thinking about courts. I was thinking about a man who ran a business built on other men in Appos. Insecurity, standing in a mirrored room telling a combat medic she didn't in Appos. Know what tough meant. End quote. Friday. End quote. I said. End quote. What time? End quote. I didn't in Appos train that week, not in the way people mean when they talk about training. I didn't in Appos run stairs or hit a bag or drink protein out of a jug. What I did instead was something closer to remembering. A slow, deliberate unpacking of a version of myself I had spent 6 years folding up small enough to fit inside a quiet suburban life. I thought, more than once that week, about a night in Kunar province I don and Appos. Talk about, not even with Denise, not even with the bourbon loosening the words in my throat. We and Appos, taken small arms fire from a compound we and Appos, been told was clear, bad intel, the kind that gets men killed and nobody and Appos, ever held responsible for it, and a private named Dawes had caught a round through the meat of his shoulder, missing the subclavian by less than an inch of luck he had and Appos, earned and wooed and Appos, have believed if you and Appos, told him. I remember the sound before I remember the sight of him. A wet, surprised grunt, the particular noise a body makes when it hasn't and Appos, yet decided how much pain to report. He went down hard against a mud brick wall. And I was moving before my brain had finished processing that the round meant for someone else had found him instead. The compound was still hot. Rounds were cracking off the wall above us, close enough that grit rained down onto both of us every few seconds, and Sergeant Okafor was screaming into the radio for a medevac bird that was still 11 minutes out by the time anyone could give me a straight answer. 11 minutes is a long time to keep a man in Appos. Blood inside his body with nothing but gauze, pressure, and the sheer stubbornness of not letting him die on your watch. I remember kneeling over him in the dark with my hands slick, packing the wound while rounds cracked overhead, and I remember that my hands did not shake. Not because I wasn't in Appos, afraid. I was afraid in a way that lived somewhere below language, a fear with no room left over for thought, but because somewhere in my training fear and function had been rewired to run on separate circuits. Dawes kept trying to look down at his own shoulder, the particular panic of a young man who has never before had to consider his body as something breakable, and I kept my voice flat and almost bored, the tone you use on someone you need to believe nothing catastrophic is happening even while you both know it might be. You and Appos, refine. Stay with me. Tell me about your girl back home, the one from the letters. He talked about a girl named Priya from Tulsa the entire 11 minutes, slurring worse near the end, and I packed and repacked that wound with hands that felt like they belonged to someone steadier than the woman actually attached to them. He lived. He went home with a scar the size of a silver dollar and, last I heard, married the girl from the letters. I never told him, never told anyone, that somewhere around minute 9 with the bird still not visible and his pulse going thready under my fingers, I had made peace, quickly and completely, with the idea that I might watch him die in front of me and have to keep functioning anyway. You could be terrified and still be precise. You could be shattering on the inside and still tie a knot exactly right. That was the gift the army gave me, the one nobody warns you follows you home. The ability to feel nothing while doing everything correctly, for exactly as long as the situation demands it, and not 1 second longer than that. I hadn't oppose. T used that particular gift in 6 years. Sitting on the edge of a bad motel mattress the week before Friday, I felt it stir awake again, the way an old injury announces itself before a storm. Grant used to call that flatness and quote, distance, end quote. He never understood that the distance wasn't oppose, T emptiness. It was discipline worn thin from years of use, still holding when everything else had given way. On Wednesday I drove out to see Okafor. He and oppose. D left the service 2 years before me and settled 40 minutes east, running a small auto shop with his brother-in-law and coaching youth wrestling on weekends, the kind of soft-landing civilian life that always made me a little jealous when I let myself think about it too long. He took one look at me standing in his garage doorway, the set of my jaw, probably, or the way I was standing with my weight already shifted onto the balls of my feet without meaning to, and set down the wrench he was holding. End quote. Who do I need to worry about? End quote, he said. Not a question. Okafor had never asked questions when a statement would do. I told him the whole thing, standing in that garage that smelled like motor oil and cut grass, and he listened the way he used to listen on comms, completely without interrupting, filing away details for later use. When I got to the part about the bet, about Marcus and his mirror gym and his 4-ounce gloves, Okafor let out a short, humorless laugh. End quote. Man like that, end quote, he said, wiping his hands on a rag, end quote, has never once had to fight for something he couldn't and oppose, T afford to lose. That and oppose. S your whole advantage right there. He and oppose. S fighting for an audience. You and oppose. Re-fighting because you and oppose. V got nothing left he can take from you that matters. End quote. He paused, studying me the way he used to study a patrol map before deciding on a route. End quote. You remember Kuhner. Dawes. End quote. End quote. I remember. End quote. End quote. You didn't and oppose. T win that night because you were bigger or stronger or trained harder than the situation. You won it because you and oppose. D already made peace with the worst outcome before it happened, and that peace is what let your hands stay steady. Whatever happens Friday, you already know how to do that part. The fighting and oppose. S just logistics after that. End quote. He didn't and oppose. T offered to come with me and I didn't and oppose. T asked him to. Some things you have to carry alone, the same way you sometimes have to sit with a dying man and oppose. S hand in yours without anyone else and oppose. S fear crowding the room. But he walked me back out to my car, and before I pulled out of his driveway, he leaned down to the window and said, end quote, go slow when it counts. Everybody in that room and oppose. S going to be moving fast and loud. You don and oppose. T have to match their tempo. You never did. End quote. I thought about that the entire drive home. On Thursday night I drove past Ignite Performance once slow the way I used to case a compound before a raid, checking sightlines, exits, the layout of the main floor visible through the glass front. Mirrored walls. A raised mat area in the back, blue vinyl, ringed by a low chain barrier. Heavy bags on chains near the entrance. A front desk with a bowl of protein bars and a stack of waiver forms. Ordinary. Harmless looking. The kind of place where people go to feel powerful in small curated doses. I thought about my knee, the one that still ached before a rainstorm, and did the math on what a woman 2 years out of active conditioning could realistically survive against a man 12 years younger who trained 6 days a week and fought amateur cards on weekends. The math wasn't an oppose, T good. I decided the math didn't an oppose, T matter. There is a category of fight you don and oppose. T win with cardio. You win it, if you win it at all, with the part of you that has already accepted the cost of losing and decided to show up anyway. Friday morning, Denise found me in her kitchen at 6 a.m., already dressed, sitting perfectly still at the table with both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee I hadn't and oppose. T touched. She didn't and oppose. T asked if I was sure. She and oppose. D stopped asking that question sometime around Wednesday, once she understood it wasn't an oppose. T really a question I was capable of answering differently. End quote. You eat something today, end quote. She said instead, sliding a plate of eggs in front of me with the brisk, unsentimental care she and oppose, D inherited from our mother. End quote. Whatever happens tonight, you and Oppos. Re not doing it on an empty stomach. I didn't and Oppos. T raise you, okay I didn't and Oppos. T co-raise you to faceplant from low blood sugar in front of the whole town. End quote. End quote. You didn't and Oppos. T raise me at all. You and Oppos. Re 18 months older than me. End quote. End quote. Details. End quote. She sat down across from me, studying my face the way she used to study it when we were kids, and she could tell, before I said a word, that something had gone wrong at school. End quote. You scared? End quote. I thought about the question honestly before I answered it, because Denise was the one person left in my life who and Oppos. D notice if I gave her a performance instead of the truth. End quote. Some end quote. I admitted. End quote. Not about getting hurt. I and Oppos. V been hurt worse for less reason. I think I and Oppos. Am scared of what happens after. Of what it means that some part of me actually wants to do this. End quote. End quote. It means you and Oppos. Re-human Ren. You spent 6 years pretending you weren't an Oppos. T allowed to want anything loud. Wanting this doesn't an Oppos. T make you a monster. It makes you finally honest. End quote. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand once hard, the way she used to before I shipped out. End quote. Go eat your eggs. Then go remind that whole gym why nobody should ever mistake quiet for weak. End quote. Friday night, Ignite performance was packed tighter than I and Oppos. D expected 40 maybe 50 people crowded along the mirrored walls, gym regulars in tank tops, a cluster of Marcus and Oppos. S amateur fighter friends with the particular loose swagger of men who and Oppos. D never lost anything that mattered to them. The air smelled like chalk, rubber matting, and the sharp citrus tang of a dozen different body sprays layered on top of each other. I wore what I and Oppos. D worn to 100 PT sessions. Plain black leggings, a gray compression shirt, hair pulled back tight enough that nothing would catch a grip. No jewelry. No shoes. When I walked through the front doors, the low murmur of conversation dipped, then died entirely, the particular silence of a room recalibrating its expectations. Kaylee stood near the front desk in workout gear that had clearly been chosen for the cameras half the crowd was holding up. When she saw me, her chin lifted, but her eyes didn't and Oppos. T quite meet mine. The tell of someone performing bravery rather than possessing it. Grant stood a few feet from her, arms crossed, and when our eyes met across the room, I watched something complicated cross his face. Not quite guilt, not quite doubt, something closer to a man realizing 30 seconds too late that he might have miscalculated the size of what he and Oppos D set in motion. Marcus was already on the mat, bouncing lightly on the balls of his feet in a fresh pair of fight shorts with his gym and Oppos S logo stitched down one leg, taping his own wrists with theatrical slowness for the benefit of the crowd. He was built the way men build themselves when the mirror is the primary audience. Wide shoulders, narrow waist, skin gleaming under the fluorescence. He had 4 inches on me and probably 40 pounds, and he carried all of it high, chest out, chin up, a stance that photographs well and defends poorly. End quote. Well, look who showed, end quote. He called out, loud enough to carry over the low bass thumping from a speaker in the corner. End quote. Everybody, this is Ren. Grant and Oppos' wife. She and Oppos' a war hero apparently, so we should all be very afraid, end quote. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, the kind people offer up on cue, checking each other and Oppos' faces to make sure laughing is safe. I stepped onto the mat. The vinyl was cool and slightly tacky under my bare feet. Exactly the texture I remembered from the gym and Oppos' front window. End quote. 5 minutes, end quote. Marcus announced, gesturing to a heavyset man holding a phone with a stopwatch app open. End quote. She survives without tapping, without getting put out. Grant signs the house over free and clear, and I and Oppos' I'll cut the check myself if he can, and Oppos' T cover it. She taps or she doesn't, and Oppos' T show the house claim, and Oppos' dead, and she walks away with nothing. Fair? End quote. End quote. Start the clock, end quote, I said. The room went quiet. The stopwatch guy called time. Marcus came in fast, the way confident men always do when they and Oppos' never once had to fight for their life instead of for an audience. He threw a jab to test me, and I let it land. A sharp sting across my left cheekbone, my head snapping back just enough to sell the hit. The crowd made a collective noise, half gasp, half hunger. I tasted copper where my lip caught my teeth. He circled, threw a low kick that cracked against my thigh hard enough to leave a bruise blooming beneath the fabric within seconds, and I let that land too. I was reading him. Rhythm. Cadence. Intent. The same three things I used to read in Gunfire before I moved. Marcus fought like a man who had never once had to consider the cost of losing. Every strike thrown with the loose, showy confidence of someone performing for cameras rather than defending against a threat that intended to end the exchange quickly. He kept glancing, almost involuntarily, toward the crowd between combinations, checking that his audience was properly impressed. A man reading a room instead of reading his opponent is a man who has already made himself easier to hurt, though he doesn't and Oppos. Know it yet. Somewhere behind him I caught a flash of Grant and Oppos' face, pale, arms still crossed, but no longer wearing the smug anticipation he and Oppos' walked in with. He looked for just a moment like a man watching a car crash he and Oppos' helped cause and could no longer stop. He stepped in for a combination, telegraphing it with a shift of weight through his lead shoulder that anyone trained to look for tells would have caught from across the room. That was when I stopped playing his game. I didn't an Oppos' retreat from the strike. I closed the distance, the single hardest habit to unlearn from years of training, the instinct to get inside the threat instead of away from it, because distance is what a striker needs and collapsing it is the fastest way to take that weapon away from him. I slipped my head off the center line, felt his glove graze past my ear instead of catch flush, and stepped in tight enough that his own reach became useless. My right hand found the side of his neck, not a strike, a control point, fingers finding the angle of his jaw the way I and Oppos' been taught to check an unconscious soldier and Oppos' airway 100 times in the dark. My left hand hooked his lead arm and pulled it across his own body, wrecking his base. I swept my foot behind his ankle, and the two of us went down together, my full weight landing on his chest as the air blew out of him in one long, ugly gasp. The crowd and Oppos' noise spiked and then dropped into something closer to confusion. This wasn't an Oppos' the shape of a fight they recognize from cage matches on television. There was no posturing, no dramatic ground and pound. I stayed flat against him, dead weight, exactly the way I and Oppos' been trained to pin a thrashing patient still enough to work on them. My forearm found his throat and settled there, not to choke off blood flow entirely, just enough to make every breath a negotiation, while my other hand pinned his taped wrist flat against the mat. Marcus bucked hard, his legs kicking, his free hand slapping uselessly against my shoulder. Somewhere in the crowd a woman and Oppos' voice, not Kaylee and Oppos' shrieked something I didn't and Oppos' catch, and the low hip-hop bass in the corner kept thumping obliviously along beneath it all, absurd and out of step with the sudden gravity of the room. His face, a moment ago so pleased with itself, went from red to a mottled, panicked purple. His eyes, I watched this very deliberately because I wanted to remember it, lost every trace of performance. What was left underneath was simple, animal and honest. The first true thing I and Oppos' seen from him all night. He tapped. Once, twice, a third time, his palm slapping frantic against the vinyl. I held for 2 seconds past the tap. Not out of cruelty, though I understood in the moment how easily it could look that way to a room that had never learned the difference between control and rage. I held it because I wanted him to feel, for 2 full seconds, the exact texture of what it is to have your survival depend entirely on someone else and Oppos' mercy. Then I released him and stood, rolling my shoulder once, feeling the ache already settling into my bruised thigh. Marcus rolled onto his side, coughing, dragging air back into his lungs in long ragged pulls. The room had gone utterly, completely silent. Even the corner speaker seemed to have lost its nerve. 40-50 people staring at a woman in a gray compression shirt with a split lip, standing over a man they and Oppos' all watched build his entire identity around a mat he now couldn't and Oppos' get off of fast enough. End quote. How long? End quote. I asked the man with the stopwatch, my voice flat and unhurried. He looked at his phone like it had betrayed him personally. End quote. 38 seconds. End quote, he said. I found Grant and Oppos' eyes across the room before I found Kaylee and Oppos'. He looked in that moment like a man watching a house he thought he understood suddenly reveal a basement he and Oppos' never known existed. Kaylee had her hand pressed flat against her own sternum, the same instinctive gesture I once taught Grant to check a racing heart. Except she was doing it to herself now, and I doubt she understood why. I didn't and oppose, T gloat. There was no triumph in me. The fight had cost me more than it looked like it cost, the ache in my knee already sharpening towards something that would need ice and ibuprofen and 2 days of careful movement. What I felt instead was something quieter and stranger, the sensation of a held breath finally released, after 2 years of not noticing I and oppose, D been holding it. And quote, Marcus and quote, I said loud enough to carry and quote, I expect the settlement paperwork by Monday. Full equity in writing notarized. If it ISN and oppose, TI and oppose will be back, not for a rematch. For the fire inspection I mentioned on the phone. Your suppression system over the back mat area is 6 inches too close to code minimum. And I noticed at least 2 exits blocked by equipment racks when I walked in. I and oppose. LL bring the county with me next time. And quote. Then I turned to Grant. And quote, you didn't and oppose. T have to let this happen and quote. I told him quiet enough that it was just for him, not the room. And quote, you could have just been honest with me 18 months ago before any of this. I would have let you go without a single fight, Grant. I and oppose. Am not the one who turned this into a war. And quote. He didn't and oppose, T answer. I don and oppose. T think he had anything left to say that wouldn't and oppose. T have made things worse for him and to his credit, he seemed to understand that. I walked out through the double glass doors into a cool October night, the kind of air that used to remind me of pre-dawn convoys, back when cold air meant something was about to happen. My lips stung. My thigh throbbed in time with my pulse. I got into my car, sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel, and let myself shake, not from fear, but from the release of 6 years of holding a version of myself very, very still. The settlement paperwork arrived Tuesday, 2 days late and clearly rushed, but it arrived notarized exactly as promised. Grant and oppose. S. attorney had apparently had a very direct conversation with Marcus and oppose. S. attorney about the legal unenforceability of gym floor wagers, and a separate, considerably more direct conversation about what a licensed fire and safety inspector could do to a business and oppose. S. operating permits if she felt sufficiently motivated. Whatever combination of pressures produced the outcome was clean. Full equity in the house, split fairly, no further contest. I signed my half of the closing documents at a title company 2 towns over, in a beige conference room with a fake ficus in the corner, and felt nothing more dramatic than the particular relief of watching a long paper trail finally reach its last page. I didn't and oppose. T go back to Ignite performance. I never filed the inspection complaint either, though I let the threat of it live in the world a while longer than I strictly needed to, the way you leave a rifle visible on a table sometimes not because you intend to use it, but because its visibility does useful work all on its own. I heard through the county grapevine months later that Marcus had quietly brought in a contractor to fix 2 of the exact code violations I and oppose. D named on the phone, which told me everything I needed to know about how seriously he and oppose D taken the threat, even if he never once admitted it out loud to anyone. Kaylee called me one more time in December, nearly 2 months after the fight. I almost didn't and oppose. T pick up, her name wasn't an oppose. T saved in my phone, but I recognized the number by then, the way you recognize a sound you and oppose. V been braced to hear again. She didn't and oppose. T opened with an apology, not exactly. She opened by telling me that things with Grant had and quote, gotten complicated and quote, her voice smaller than it had been in October, stripped of the rehearsed brightness, and quote, I guess I wanted to ask if it gets easier and quote, she said, and quote, finding out someone and oppose, s not who you thought, end quote. I sat with that question longer than she probably expected me to. There was a version of me, even a few months earlier, who would have hung up rather than offer this woman a single ounce of comfort. But something about her voice, thin, unsure, finally honest in a way it hadn't and oppose. T been on our first call, reminded me of my own voice on a bathroom floor at 2 a.m., a long time before Grant had learned how to stop showing up for it. And quote, it gets easier once you stop needing them to be who you thought they were, end quote, I told her. End quote, Grant didn't and oppose. T become a different person when he cheated. He just stopped hiding the person he and oppose. D already become. That and oppose, s a hard thing to sit with, but it and oppose. S the honest version, and the honest version is the only one that actually heals. End quote. She didn't and oppose. T say much after that. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I almost asked if she was still there, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had lost the last of its performance entirely. End quote, for what it and Oppo's worth, end quote, she said, end quote, I didn't and Oppo's T know how bad things had gotten between you two. He made it sound like the marriage had been over for years before I ever showed up. I don't and Oppo's T know if that and Oppo's true. I don't and Oppo's T know if it matters anymore either way. End quote, it and Oppo's true mostly, end quote. I told her because I owed her at least that much honesty, even if I owed her nothing else. End quote. The marriage was over long before you showed up. You didn't and Oppo's T end it. You were just the first thing either of us let ourselves be honest about, end quote. I didn't and Oppo's T tell her the rest, that being the symptom of a wound doesn't and Oppo's T make you innocent of choosing to walk into someone else and Oppo's marriage anyway, that two things can be true at once, that a collapsing house and the person who lit the final match aren't and Oppo's T the same thing but aren't and Oppo's T entirely separate either. Some lessons I and Oppo's V learned people have to arrive at on their own timeline, and mine wasn't and Oppo's T hers to rush. I don't and Oppo's T know what became of her after that call. I heard secondhand and unreliably that she and Oppo's D left Ignite Performance sometime in the spring, and that Grant had moved into a rental across the county line not long after, but I stopped tracking either of them with any real attention once the paperwork cleared. Some wounds you dress and then simply let close on their own, without checking on them every day to make sure they and Oppo's re-healing the way you and Oppo's D planned. Denise asked me, a few weeks later, sitting at her kitchen table with the same jelly jars and a considerably lighter bottle of bourbon, whether I regretted it, the fight, the theater of it, the way half the town had apparently heard some version of the story by the following weekend, most of them wildly inaccurate, several of them making me out to be either a monster or a myth, depending who was telling it. End quote, I don't and Oppo's T regret the fight, end quote, I told her. End quote. I regret that it took someone threatening me for money before I let myself feel anything about the marriage ending. I spent 2 years being so careful not to feel the wound that I almost let it kill something in me anyway. End quote. She didn't and Oppo's T say anything clever back. She just refilled my glass, which between sisters is its own kind of answer. I moved into a small rental across town in November. Nothing fancy, a 1-bedroom with good light and a kitchen too small for 2 people to occupy comfortably, which suited me fine. I went back to work. I still flinch sometimes at sounds that Dawn and Oppo's T deserve it. A dropped pan, a car backfiring 2 streets over, but less than I used to, oddly, as though something in me had recalibrated after Ignite Performance in a way 6 years of quiet suburban living never managed. I heard secondhand that Grant and Kaylee lasted 4 more months before it fell apart under its own weight. Apparently a relationship built to prove a point doesn't and Oppo's T hold up well once the point and Oppo's been made and there and Oppo's nothing left to prove. I felt nothing when I heard it. Not vindication, not sympathy. Just the flat, professional non-reaction of someone reading a case file that no longer concerns them. What I did feel, in the months after, was something closer to recognition. Not of Grant, not of Marcus, not even of the marriage itself, but of myself. The parts one had folded up small enough to fit into a life that no longer needed folding. I started running again, not stairs for conditioning, just slow miles along the river path near my new apartment, and I noticed somewhere around the 2nd month that I wasn't in Oppo's T running from anything anymore. I was just running. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles into a life after the held breath finally lets go. It ISN and Oppo's T peace, not exactly. Peace implies an absence of conflict, and I don't and Oppo's T think I and Oppo's LL ever be entirely free of the low-grade vigilance 9 years of service wired into me. But it and Oppo's close. It and Oppo's the quiet of a woman who spent a long time being told her steadiness was actually a kind of absence, and who finally, in a mirrored room that smelled like chalk and citrus body spray, got the chance to prove that the steadiness had simply been waiting for a reason worth spending it on. The following spring, almost exactly a year after I found that message on Grant and Oppo's phone, Okafor called and asked if I and Oppo's come coach the girls and Oppo's wrestling clinic he ran on Saturday mornings. Nothing formal, just showing a dozen 13-year-olds how to break a grip, how to drop their hips, how to stop apologizing with their bodies for taking up space on a mat. I said yes before he and Oppos. D finished the sentence. The first Saturday a girl named Ophelia, all elbows and nerves, asked me during a water break whether I and Oppos D ever actually been in a real fight, the kind that mattered. I thought about Kuhner, about Dawes and the 11 longest minutes of my life, about a blue vinyl mat that smelled like chalk and citrus body spray, about a marriage that had ended not with a scream but with a dish towel folded neatly over the edge of a sink. End quote, a few end quote, I told her. End quote. The ones that mattered most weren't and Oppos T the ones anybody was watching end quote. She didn't and Oppos T fully understand what I meant not yet, she was 13, and understanding that particular truth takes most people considerably longer than a Saturday morning. But she nodded like she was filing it away for later, the way you file away something you know you and Oppos LL need someday, and went back out onto the mat to try the hip escape again, elbows tucked, chin down, steady. I stood at the edge of that mat in a gym that smelled nothing like Ignite Performance and everything like every gym I and Oppos D ever set foot in, sweat and rubber and the particular optimism of people trying to get better at something hard. And I understood, finally, that the version of myself I and Oppos D folded away for 6 years hadn't and Oppos T been lost after all. She and Oppos D just been waiting, patient and steady, for someone worth unfolding for. I don't and Oppos T know if I handled it the right way. I and Oppos V turned it over more times than I and Oppos D like to admit, whether there was a version of that Friday night where I walked away from Marcus and Oppos S bed entirely, let the lawyers grind it out slow and boring the way divorces are supposed to grind, kept my hands, my knee, my dignity out of a gym mat in front of 50 strangers with their phones held up. Maybe that version of me is better. Kinder certainly. More patient. But I think about Dawes sometimes bleeding out under my hands in the dark, and I think about the particular kind of stillness it takes to do the right thing when everything around you is telling you to panic. I wasn't in Oppos T panicking on that mat. I was for the first time in 2 years exactly where I meant to be, doing exactly what I and Oppos D trained a lifetime to do, not fighting for a house, not fighting for pride, but proving to myself as much as anyone watching, that the quiet ones in the room are usually the ones you should have been paying closer attention to all along.